Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'd like to welcome you to the Campfire chat organized by the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative on the topic of governance gaps for large-scale carbon dioxide removal. We have 5 experts, guest speakers with us to share their experience and, more importantly, their different perspectives on these issues. In a moment, I will ask them to self-introduce themselves. I just want to remind the participants that this is going to be a discussion around the virtual campfire. We won't have long speeches, slide presentations. The emphasis really is on discussion and first within the guest speakers and then answering your questions. So let me start by introducing myself. I am Janos Pasztor. I'm the Executive Director of the C2G, or the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative. I've been doing this since 2016. Before that, I was with the UN. My last position was Assistant Secretary General for Climate Change. I've worked with various United Nations and non-governmental organizations over the years. And it's now pretty much 4 decades of work on climate change. And in fact, I worked with pretty much everyone on this panel in one capacity or another, whether it was with WWF or with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change or the UN Environment Program or other places where I worked. But as I said, I've been working on this for 4 decades, and clearly what we see on climate change doesn't give us a good report card. So I certainly feel that the job is unfinished and there's still a few things left to be done. And I hope that our discussion will contribute to that. So with that, can I ask Thelma, please introduce yourself.
Yes, thanks, Jano. And I am Thelma Krug, and I was a former senior researcher at the National Institute for Space Research in Brazil. And for 13 years, I have been co-chair of the IPCC Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Task Force on National Greenhouse Gas Inventories. And then on 2015, I was elected one of the 3 vice chairs of the IPCC. For many years, I would say about 13 years, I represented Brazil in the negotiations in the Climate Change Convention, and particularly on issues related to land use change and forestry. So I think that is basically it, Janos. Thank you.
Thank you, Thelma. Stephan, can I come to you, please?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Janos. Stephan Singer. I work for Climate Action Network International, representing about 1,500 NGOs worldwide in 120 countries, environmental NGOs, development NGOs, face groups, social justice, climate justice, and grassroots groups, etc., etc. I work for Climate Action Network International since 5 years. Before that one, I had been more than 20 years with WWF. I was Director Energy Policy there. Today with CAN, I try to advise and help my friends and colleagues in the civil society movements on climate science policy and clean energy policy.
Thank you, Stephan. Paul, can I come to you?
Sure. Good afternoon, or good morning, or whatever it is, wherever people are in the world. Paul Watkinson. I work for the French Ministry of Ecological Transition, and for many years I worked running a delegation in the multilateral climate talks under the United Nations Framework Convention, and I was also part of the team that prepared and ran COP21, which produced the Paris Agreement. And in the past 2 years, 2018 and 2019, I was chair of the subsidiary body of scientific and technological cooperation under the Climate Convention. I should stress that I'm speaking very much in a personal capacity, and nothing I say commits any of the organizations which I work or have worked over time.
Thank you, Paul. Julio, can I continue with you, please?
Sure. Yes. Good morning. Good afternoon. Good evening. Thank you for the invitation. My name is Julio Cornado. I I'm currently the Director of Environment and Ocean Affairs in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Chile. I've basically been involved in the UNFCCC negotiations for some time now. I guess the most important part of that role was as a coordinator of the negotiation team for the COP25 presidency. And on that capacity, we were in charge of the presidency role in COP25 in Madrid. I'm also an adaptation committee member in the UNFCCC. So that's basically been my connection to this. And as Paul was saying, I'm also speaking on my personal capacity and in this important topic. But none of my opinions at the moment can represent or intend to represent the views of my government. Thank you.
Thank you, Julio. And before going on to Bill, just to say, Thelma, that this is a campfire chat and your cat is totally welcome. So just when she wants to speak, please mention it so we can turn on the interpretation. Thank you. Okay, Bill, it's your turn.
Yeah, I'm Bill Hare, and I'll try and keep my dog out of Thelma's vision. I've been involved with the climate issue now for more than 30 years, I guess. So I started out working in Australia. I was actually on the Australian delegation that negotiated the climate convention, then worked for Greenpeace International for a number of years on many aspects of the climate issue before starting climate analytics at the end of 2008, which is headquartered in Berlin. I'm now based in Western Australia, actually partly due to COVID. So I've got a broad experience on the issues. I've also been involved with the IPCC in different capacities, including as a lead author in one of the assessments and so on. So I'm rather interested to hear the different perspectives tonight, including from all friends and colleagues. I'm sure there's going to be quite a lively discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And as you can see, we have a fantastic group of guests with us. So I also look forward to the discussion. Now, just a few words about the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative. We're a foundation philanthropy-funded initiative. We are 16 people working virtually, even before COVID, on 3 continents. And our mission is very simple. It's to catalyze the creation of effective governance frameworks for approaches that can alter the climate, such as carbon dioxide removal or solar radiation modification. Our role is impartial about the use or not of these approaches and technologies. One part of our strategy is to encourage learning through conversations like the one, for example, we're going to have today around this virtual campfire. Now, the purpose of these discussions, these campfire chats, is to really show the diversity of views based on different political, cultural contexts and experiences that the people we invite have. And of course, in order to really demonstrate the diversity, we need, of course, as many people on each campfire chat as the diversity, but that's impossible. So we do the best we can to bring in people with different geographical, gender, socio-political backgrounds and so on. But we obviously can't achieve that at every single webinar and every single campfire chat. But on the whole, I think when we look at that, I think we now have over 50 experts who've been engaged in this process. I think we've done pretty well. Now, I encourage our speakers and I encourage the participants to ask challenging questions, but of course, all the views expressed here are those of the guests and not necessarily of the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative. A few words about the context in which we're meeting, and I don't think I want to say too much because we have much better speakers here, but it's pretty clear on the one hand that the climate crisis continues. The impacts are visible wherever you look, whether it's the Arctic, whether it's forest fires, whether it's extreme heat in different parts of the world. And we also know from many scientific studies, including in particular from the IPCC's special report on 1.5 degree and others, that emission reductions must go into absolute full speed. And even then, even if we are able to maximize our emission reductions, we will still need some level of carbon dioxide removal of some of the carbon dioxide removal approaches in order to be able to maintain the Paris goals. And we need those removals to first offset the difficult emissions, aiming for net zero. And then we will need those removals to go beyond net zero into the net negative period at some point in the future. Now, the unfortunate reality is that the world is not yet in turbo mode for emission reduction. So the relationship between the speed and the amount of carbon, the speed of emission reductions and carbon removal is clearly something we will need to discuss. What is interesting as a backdrop to our discussion is that a number of countries have committed themselves to net zero targets by 2050. And then the question arises, what do they need to do both on carbon removals themselves and the governance challenges that these issues are posed? And that is what we want to focus our discussion today. Sometimes it's unavoidable to get into some technical discussion of the different approaches, but what we really want to focus on is what are the governance challenges? What are the gaps in governance that need to be addressed? Why we think that those gaps are there and how we can meet them. So, and how different intergovernmental and other international processes actually address those issues. So that's what we would like to discuss. We will not be able to address all these issues clearly, but we hope to be able to contribute to the discussions. Now, in terms of the mechanics, what will happen is that I will ask each of our guest speakers to say a few words at the beginning, and I will ask a specific question from each one of them. And then there will be a bit of a discussion between the speakers themselves. And then at one point, we will start looking at the questions posed by the participants. So dear participants, please start formulating your questions, if you have any, and put them on the Q&A bullet of the Zoom functionality. There is also a like button. So in case you see a question there that you like yourself, click that, and that will increase the chances of that particular question being addressed. We'll try to answer all the questions or address all the questions, but of course, if there are too many, we may run out of time. There's also a chat button. You can chat if you like, but don't put the questions in the chat because we won't be able to necessarily follow all of that. So this is basically the plan. Now let's look forward to hearing some thoughts from our guest speakers. And I would like to start with Julio. Julio, you mentioned your background in this area of work, and of course, COP25 presidency. And in that context, how can you best frame the issue of large-scale carbon dioxide removal, looking at the overall context of mitigation ambition in the agreed international process, which is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change? So over to you, Julio.
Thank you, Janos. Yes, it's a very good question, and I guess one needs to start, putting our fingers in the fact that we are really short of ambition. I think one of the things that really concern everybody and really keeps the ball rolling in the process is the fact that we haven't done enough. Is the fact that we have committed ourselves through the Paris Agreement to a long-term goal that is not backed up with enough action and enough ambition. And I should say that for the moment, we have had a discussion about targets, but not necessarily about how to achieve those targets. So as you were rightly saying, I think we have good signs from some major emitters that have recently announced that want to achieve carbon neutrality. Some of them before 2060, like China, or some of them by 2050, like the European Union and others. I think the recent announcement from Japan and Korea are also quite exciting and a good sign. But at the same time, I think it continues to be a target in the future that is not aligned or is not accompanied by a clear understanding of how those achievements will be, how those targets will be achieved. That's when this conversation comes into place, because my understanding is that the emission reductions is absolutely an irreplaceable part of the equation, and we cannot forget the fact that when we are talking about climate change and reducing emissions, we're not talking only about lowering the pressure on the carbon budget in the atmosphere, but we're talking about the transition towards an economy, a society, a change in culture, in the way we relate with nature. So it's very deep concepts that in order to achieve those goals, carbon reductions needs to happen. So and that can only be achieved through a lower dependency on fossil fuels. If you say that we will suck up the air and filter that and reduce the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, that can open the door for sort of an option where you have more time to continue burning fossil fuels, and that's against the very nature of what we're talking about. So I think that is something that we need to keep in mind when we discuss this. And so this is where the idea of CDR technologies can come into place, and from that frame, you can address things like overshooting, for example. When you say, we are in an ambitious pathway, but we have hit some overshooting in the trajectory of the emission reductions, and we might need to use some technologies in order to adjust a little bit that overshooting, not because we don't want to reduce those emissions, because there is a clear commitment to do it, but because using those technologies can help us reduce further those emissions. So I think that is an important concept, not always easy to explain or to understand, but central to this discussion. The same thing would happen with this idea that it is already in the IPCC reports that in the second half of the century we should be not only net zero but also negative in emissions. So some of those, when we get to the very, very lower end of our emissions, and maybe the abatement costs are very high, at that time there could be a possibility of considering reductions that would necessarily go through CDR and artificially, so to speak, removing CO2 from the atmosphere. But having said that, I think it's also important to say that at the level of knowledge that we have right now, and the IPCC is and Thelma would surely will can explain this better than myself. But the IPCC has been clearly considering some options outside of the net reduction of emissions, but concentrating in nature-based solutions, and afforestation and bioenergy with the carbon capture and storage. So things that use the natural cycle of carbon in order to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So what I'm trying to say is that those technologies that are more in the forefront of innovation are still somehow in the fringes of the analysis, and this is basically due to a issue of scales of deployment of those technologies. But also about the safety of those technologies. I think that this is also something very important to keep in mind. I'm conscious that maybe I haven't really gone into the nature of the question, which is about the process itself. And I think the UNFCCC process has not been very active in looking for answers in the technologies that we are talking about. Basically because NDCs are about emission reductions and addressing deforestation and stuff like that. So it's the more traditional way of thinking these things. There's been some discussion about CDR in market discussion, as Paul can probably also be a witness of, and say something about that probably. But there might be a need also to think about the use of these technologies in the context of the transparency framework. So how we can actually report on that, something that can be acceptable to everybody, that is a contribution and not something that will raise eyebrows and say, well, maybe you are achieving something, but at the same time, where maybe you are creating some problems for other countries. There are many elements, and I know that I'm going over time, so I'll leave it there, and hope that's useful as an introduction.
Thank you, Julio. And there was one thing that you mentioned that I'd like to come back later in the discussion when we look at the governance gaps themselves. But you mentioned the importance of making sure that emission reductions will not be hurt by carbon dioxide removal activities. So that question of what one does in terms of the governance framework to make sure that it doesn't happen. So something to come back to. But can I now turn to Paul? And I'd like to ask you, from your perspective, what are the key priority governance gaps and why those are the key ones and the priority ones? So over to you. Paul, I think you're frozen.
Okay. Well, I'm happy to.
You're there. Okay, good.
Yeah, I think there might be some connection issues. I hope it's working okay.
Working okay.
I'll turn off my screen. I'll turn off my image for a moment if it carries on, but I'll try to keep going. I think it solves itself. Yes, I may not get too much into the detailed priorities because I think those will come out maybe more as we discuss. But I want to raise a few areas, and I think it builds quite well on what you said, Janos, in your first comments, and in particular what Julio has just said. Because it seems to me the areas we really need to get to grips with in talking about carbon dioxide removal at large scale is firstly when and how it is really acceptable and necessary. We already have many areas where we work on absorptions in the sinks area. Thelma talked about having worked in the forest area for many years in our discussions. We've talked about this a lot in the past. There are things we traditionally do that are part of the areas we know about and have worked on. But we're talking about moving to much greater scale. Even if we're using those activities moving into large scale afforestation, BECCS, other fields, we're moving into different scales of the use of these techniques or technologies. So that is a first part, which I think we need to be conscious of. And I think linked to that, and in particular, picking up on the issue about the reducing emissions as being absolutely essential. This is not an alternative to bringing our emissions down to zero or as close to zero as we can get. It's about how we complete that, particularly in some areas, and then help us move into negative emissions in where and when we will need it. So we really can keep 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees as a possibility. And I think for a long time, particularly the Kyoto model, we thought that, you know, a ton is a ton. It doesn't matter where it comes from, what sector it comes from. If we reduce it, it's okay. Whereas clearly we have to bring everything down. There are some which will be harder than others. And we will all face trouble in particular sectors, particular regions, and over a certain time. And there's a big debate on the just transition we'll have to manage. How do we deal with that? We can't bring everything down in one go. Even the pandemic this year hasn't done that, although it has affected our emissions. So the way in which we manage that raises some big issues about the timing and the scale of that. And I think Julio mentioned overshooting, and I think it raises a number of issues about temporal equity. When do we act, and what's the speed, and what's the interaction between reducing emissions and starting to use large-scale carbon dioxide reductions. How do those fit together? And I think there's some serious equity issues around there. And I'd raise another equity issue, which is, again, if I look at this sort of Kyoto type model, you can trade, you can offset from different places. We've all got to come down to zero or close to zero in our emissions, and to build those absorptions and those negative emissions over time. But we won't all have the same possibility or capacity to do that. How does that get worked out? If in long-term strategies, some think, well, I'm going to get loads of negative emissions and absorptions from somewhere else, how do we talk about that side? And there are big geographical equity issues. When we really get to large-scale use, how does that play through? So I think there are a whole series of issues there. I'll be very brief on two other points, and then I'll wrap up my first comments. The second, and Julio's already mentioned it, is where we have rules under the Climate Convention and the Paris Agreement. And I know C2G has done some work on it. I think Bill was contributing in one of the papers I saw, as I recall. I know the tracking, credibility, verification, those matter a huge amount. If we're doing this, it can't just be, oh, I've captured lots of CO2 or I've used lots of CO2. We need to know what's happened to it, the permanence of it, and where it's being tracked, and we're following it. That verification matters. I won't get into markets and the links to Article 6 in detail, but clearly that comes back to my point about the geographical side as well. How is that credible? I'm not sure the discussions we've had so far are fit for purpose for large-scale use in this form, and I think we need a separate one. And just to finish, there are, of course, a large number of interactions with other fields. Julio mentioned nature-based solutions, which I think are extremely interesting, but there is a lot of issues about the interaction with biodiversity. There can be win-win solutions there. There can be trade-offs. And they can also link into food security, into questions of human rights, particularly for local communities, indigenous peoples, and others. Those are very complicated issues we cannot solve only under the Climate Convention or the Paris Agreement. So there are many areas which go beyond our scope and which we'll have to think about the linkages there.
Thank you, Paul, and lots of very interesting issues here. Maybe later in the discussion, if you have the possibility to say a few more words about what you mean by the temporal equity and equity. I found that interesting, but maybe it needs a few sentences just to clear what it is, but later. And now maybe I'd like to come to you, Bill, and essentially ask the same question as from Paul. What are the key priority governance gaps from your perspective, and why? And maybe it's the same list, maybe it's a different list, or maybe the reasoning is different, but look forward to hearing from you.
Yeah, thanks, Janos. Yeah, great. Look, I've got, I guess, first to frame the governance challenges. As Paul alluded to, we've done some work on this, and so we have identified the governance challenges in this area as being framed by 4 big issues. I think Julio's already mentioned that, for example, the scale and speed of mitigation. And then another big question is, what about the incentives for scaling up CDR? Second framing issue is the trade-offs and interactions with, for example, food security, water, biodiversity, which have also been mentioned, and some of the climate system risks. And these 4 key issues, as we see it, then frame what we had seen were about 9 governance challenges. I can't go through 9, of course, now, but some of the most important ones would include the responsibility, already mentioned, of who has to undertake CDR activities and implementation of these. Another governance challenge is a little bit more mundane, but really fundamental, is how do we develop systems to monitor the progress we're making towards getting towards negative emissions, towards removals. At present, we don't have a good system for doing that. How do we, third point might be the systems needed to measure, report, and verify CO2 removals. We don't really have those systems yet, nor do we have the legal architecture for that. Fourthly, as has been mentioned, a number of the the scale of the CDR measures also poses challenges for sustainable development trade-offs. How do we build that into the governance of CDR to ensure that we don't overdo it on carbon plantations, subtracting, damaging biodiversity, water or food, for example? A fifth element of concern is how do we make sure that these CDR measures are durable, that is permanent? How do we manage issues of long-term storage and ultimate saturation of storage options, including in the biosphere, so-called nature-based solutions? So these are 5 out of about 9 key governance issues, and they relate differently to different measures. So some of these issues relate quite strongly to nature-based solutions. Others are more strongly interact with more technological approaches, such as direct air capture. Looking at nature-based solutions, for example, some of the governance challenges there really very importantly relate to how to ensure that the kind of measures being proposed or introduced don't damage biodiversity, food or water security. And on the mitigation side, how do we make sure that the application of nature-based solutions don't or are not simply allowed, used to allow an increase or maintenance of emissions from the energy system that would otherwise have been reduced in the absence of those nature-based approaches? Critical issues, for example, on finally on, say, technological means of removing CO2 from the atmosphere. Some of these relate to the biodiversity, the safeguards for sustainable development, but others relate to the question of how do we provide incentives for the rollout of these technologies. Yes, we have to be achieving likely negative emissions by shortly after mid-century, but to actually be in that position, we would need to have begun to roll out these technologies decades sooner. And at present, we don't have the incentives or approaches that really encourage that to happen at scale. So I think that's another key governance issue that we need to look at in moving forward. So Janos, back to you. That's just a bit of an introduction to some of the perspectives that I have on this.
Thank you, Bill. Very, very helpful and lots of interesting points, and also to look at how some of these relate more to the nature-based type approaches and others relate more to some of the other ones. So that's also an interesting help. I'd like to now turn to Stephan and again ask the same question from your perspective. How do you see the key governance gaps and why?
Yeah, thanks, Janos. I have heard many very interesting points, and I wouldn't call them conclusions, but fuel for thoughts, which I think will be shared or are shared by many in the NGO and CSO community in a constructive way. Not that we have any solutions to that one, but I think we all learn while we walk. First, let me raise one issue, and I think Julio mentioned that one initially, and in case it was you, Julio, and then I share that one strongly. We know from science and from the IPCC that net zero targets are just an intermediary target. We need to go to net negative emissions eventually. We're currently at about 412 ppm CO2 in the atmosphere, which is probably 5 million years record of CO2 emissions, and in the Pliocene, that was leading to 2 to 4 meter sea level rise and 2 to 4 degree warmer temperatures globally. So we are lagging behind. CO2 concentrations are much faster than nature can react because we know all the lag time in the natural ecosystems. So we need to reduce concentrations significantly. I think that's a debate we have not had, and that's critical as NGOs. I think the scientists do that one, but we as NGOs are a little bit reluctant to do that one for whatever reasons. And I think it would be useful that we need to do that one as NGOs, because that's ultimately the way of protecting or limiting damage, I should say, to vulnerable ecosystems, to exposed communities, and to the physical landscape of our Earth, because runaway climate change will mean a couple of meters sea level rise eventually in the next couple of 100 years, which will destroy many livelihoods and many communities which are built up close to the sea and on islands. So we need to have that debate. I think the second point for me is, it has been said, the mantra is, the ultimate paradigm is to bring emissions down. That's a key issue. Now reduce emissions at source drastically, radically, all sources, all sectors, everywhere, and with significant funding for poor developing countries. So the equity dimension should not be underestimated. It's fundamentally important that we need to have in the rich countries a significant to pay for the poorer countries to do mitigation. And I should not ignore adaptation as well, because there will be unavoidable impacts. And even a 1.5 degree world is not a paradise. We should be honest about this one, because we see already with 1 degree's significant impacts. I think that's very important politically. Then the third point for me would be, and that goes to the governance issue, Janos, to some extent, which CDR options we would suggest. I think we need to be aware of that certain CDR options have impacts in one way or the other, some more, others less, on issues beyond climate change. People have talked about this, food security, ecosystem protection, biodiversity, etc., etc. That needs a sober analysis, and I think it's unavoidable that there might be eventually some trade-offs. I don't think we have the luxury anymore to only have win-win-win-win solutions. I think we need to make dire choices. Not that we make them, but I think governments who are responsible in the end have to make them, but they should be well advised. That we use the least damaging solutions, because we have lost 30, 40 years. I think that's a consequence of what we know. So there are trade-offs. The fourth point is more practical on the issues on CDR. What is our requirements on liability of long-term permanence? Both geological storage, such as from the technical solution like DEX, mineral weathering or BECCS, and what do we require from nature-based solutions? Of course, we as NGOs would favor nature-based solutions because they have so many other benefits, but they have also downturns. There might be limits to it. There might be saturation effects, and we have seen forests going up in flames in the last 2 years in Australia, in Siberia, and not the least in California. So I think no one knows at this point in time what is the long-term permanence in forests and ecosystems when they are confronted with climate change impacts. That doesn't mean we should not protect forests. Get me really right here. That's not my point. But in terms of carbon emissions reductions, negative emissions, we might think about having a large-scale deployment scheme in terms of research and development on issues on technologies which are not linked to nature-based solutions. Whether it's DEX, whether it's mineral weathering, I wouldn't be able to give you the recipe here, but I think we need to jump the boat and have a large research scale assessment, analysis, because we need to reduce concentrations and not only emissions. I think we need to be honest to ourselves on that one. How we do that, where we do that, what are the equity requirements, which countries are doing that first, Bill, I think you're fully right on that one, is a different debate. It's not the issue is not whether we do it, the issue is how we do that one in the most equitable way. And the governance would require to find out some of the criteria and some of the preconditions based on equity. Where should that happen? Who should put the money forward? What would the technology be? And how would that be transparently monitored and verified, including long-term liability of the storage? I stop here.
Thank you, Stephan, and that's really interesting. And this, what you said, leads us very nicely into the last question I'd like to pose now. This time to Thelma. Thelma, you've been part of many of these intergovernmental processes that are addressing these issues, either from a scientific or negotiation perspective. And you heard a number of the colleagues around this campfire talked about the linkage to other issues, trade-off synergies. So I guess my question to you is, what are the existing processes that are looking at the governance or should be looking at the governance of these issues? And if you could answer this question in a way that you already look at connections beyond the climate world, because that's what we were talking about, biodiversity, food security, things like that. Okay, so please.
Okay, thanks, Janos. And okay, let me also say a couple of things here before I start. Obviously, I will try to convey as much as possible what comes from the assessments of the IPCC. So I want to be even faithful to the language that the IPCC uses. And then, if you allow me, I will change my hat. And since this is informal, I will bring some of my own personal considerations on some issues. So I will make it.
You're welcome to use as many hats as you like.
Okay, so to make it absolutely clear that some of these might come from my own perspectives. So from the IPCC point of view, Janos, it's recognized that there are very scarce governance mechanisms, today, and basically they are either targeted to some specific CDR options, like ocean-based CDR, or aspects of the CDR, for instance, the indirect land use change related to bioenergy upscaling. And we know that the only international governance mechanism in place is the research and development of ocean fertilization within the Convention on Biological Diversity. So, so when we are talking about governance, and there's so many aspects of governance, some of them go into the international, needs to be, handled internationally under an international governance, as it was done on the, as I mentioned, on ocean fertilization. But others also need to be done and carried out at national level. And I would also like to highlight the definition of governance that IPCC applies, which is the most inclusive, definition that relates not only to the federal government, but also to all levels of governance, the civil society, the private sector. We talk about the indigenous peoples every time more and more, the local communities, as have already been highlighted, because most of these options will, in a certain way, impact the lives of people. And I will come to that aspect of governance later on, which I don't think have been explored too much from the previous speakers. So some of these options that we have for the CDR are really in a very early stage of development and few demonstrations. And obviously coupled with the considerable challenge to deploy this at scale. And speed and scale have been really highlighted by, basically everybody. But also most of the CDR options face multiple feasibility constraints. And this limits the potential for any single option to sustainably achieve the large scale deployment required to the 1.5 degrees Celsius consistent pathways. So the speed and scales required for limiting the warming to the 1.5, as the special report of the IPCC says, pose a considerable implementation challenge. And actually present, there is this dissonance between the large CO2 removals needed for the 1.5 pathways and the long time periods involved in scaling up these novel technologies. I would like to finalize this participation of mine as IPCC, bringing these considerations from the IPCC, mentioning two issues. You know that in every chapter of the IPCC, and the IPCC basically, you know, what it does is the assessment of the literature worldwide. So it doesn't do research on its own. So we do still lack some literature to really provide some support on every aspect. I would say that one of the issues that are important, that I would say really there is a lack on governance, is on the governance of research. And the IPCC raises the issue of knowledge gaps around implementing and strengthening the global response to climate change. And that would to be urgently resolved if a transition to the 1.5 world is to become a reality. And it singles out two issues that I'm going to raise, and I'm going to bring the specific language that IPCC uses in terms of these knowledge gaps. And one of them refers to the life cycle emissions and the prospects for early stage CDR options. So looking at the whole thing, not only to the aspect related to the implementation or deployment, but to the life cycle implications in terms of emissions. And another gap that is related to governance is also important, and it's mentioned in the 1.5 special report that refers to how can different actors and processes in climate governance reinforce each other and hedge against the fragmentation of initiatives. So this is the actual language that IPCC uses in the 1.5 special report. So now I turn my head and I think I feel more comfortable because we are on an informal setting. But I think that the IPCC does bring this very important element of knowledge gaps. And more than that, I would say the need for this governance of research. Janos. Governance of research is one of the issues that I think, if we look at the literature around all these CDR, and if we look at the mitigation potentials or the potentials of the CDRs, we see that the broad range of these potentials. And where are these potentials? And how can these options be implemented in different regions of the world without having the minimum social impact possible, if any, right? So all these discussions of not only looking globally, what is the potential of these CDR options, but looking at where are these potentials and what are the different social economic impacts, I would say. And as you mentioned, to also go beyond, we do see a lot of relation between these things also and the sustainable development goals. We can say that some of these could have synergies and trade-offs, as has already been mentioned, right? So I would also say that one aspect that I don't think has been explored so far, and I think that is also key for governance, relates to public awareness. Not only, because you have so many options, so many different options. Some of these we are acquainted. We are very acquainted with afforestation and reforestation. We are acquainted with bioenergy. Not so much with bioenergy, with carbon capture and storage, right? And where this is going to be storage. And we have already identified the liability issues related to the permanence, which it seems not to be, if the sites are, chosen carefully, that would not be so much of an issue. You could say that the permanence there would be for many, many, many years, thousands of years maybe. But myself, I am more concerned with the permanence of afforestation and reforestation. Because then we are not talking about 1,000 years. We are talking about a much shorter time period for the permanence issue. And more than that, it's not only the permanence in good conditions, but the permanence that have already been flagged under the climate change and then under the conditions of droughts that are driving also fires. So you're having now extreme events that put at stake some of these options, not only for afforestation and reforestation, but Julio also mentioned the nature-based solutions, which I'm gonna say that strongly, I would prefer to be called nature-based options, not necessarily solutions. So as to convey that you may not have a solution there, but in some cases it might even make things worse, right? Because suppose we do this very, afforestation and reforestation is also under the nature-based solutions. Some of them it's really important because you can make the recovery of degraded lands, recovery of the mangroves, which not only address the mitigation or the removal, but also, most importantly, maybe some of these options would be very much linked to adaptation. You know, bringing the two together would be the ideal world, right? So in some coastal zones, some of these options, nature-based options, could also bring an important contribution to adaptation. But I would say that, this is why, and coming back to the IPCC says, maybe a portfolio of options would be the best of the worlds, because then you would most likely avoid this large scale implementation for which, even under the afforestation that we so much know, but also bioenergy that we also know, we have lots of experiences worldwide. But what is a little bit frightening in terms of knowledge is what would be the impact of large scale implementation of these options. And that's where I think there is still a lack of the scientific knowledge of this. And obviously the large scale, especially for afforestation, reforestation, and BECCS. And why do I mention these? Because most of the 1.5 pathways that IPCC explored in the special report relied on these two options, right? So this is why there is more knowledge into that in the IPCC, including on the potential competition for food security. Are we competing with food? Are we competing with the production of energy, bioenergy, or energy at large? What kind of feedstocks are we using? So all these require different levels of governance. You have to finance also some of these technologies, which are still not, at the level of potentially being deployed in the next coming years. So incentives for that, so that you could have a portfolio that would most likely reduce the potential impacts. So I just, to finalize, would reinforce this need for, the governance of research, because this would allow a broader participation of countries that could be potentially more affected. They could contribute a lot for the implementation and deployment, but they could also have other impacts that need to be known. And so that would be my initial reaction to your question.
Thank you, Thelma. And before continuing, I just would like to remind our participants to put their questions forward. We're running a little bit behind time, but we'll find a way to address some of the questions, so please go ahead. Now, colleagues, are there any of you who would like to ask a follow-up question from each other? I've noted a few things that I would like to follow up on, but first, if there is anybody who would like to to sort of follow up or ask a question from each other, this is a good moment. So I see Stephan's hand, so let's do that. Go ahead, Stephan, and then Bill.
Yeah, thank you. I keep it short. Thelma, I'm going back to you. I think sorry to say, I think you make the same mistake that the IPCC has done in the past and many other scientists have been doing. We talk about afforestation, reforestation, and BECCS. We do not talk about restoration, which is a different category. And I think we need to include that one. Reforestation, afforestation tend to be industrial planted activities, as useful as they might be, right? But they are not necessarily linked to issues of addressing a multiple and plethora of other benefits. So restoration for ecosystems, and I agree with you that this is linked, that has many links to adaptation as well, are fundamentally important. But let's talk increasingly about restoration as well, in addition to protection of ecosystems as a way forward, as the key solutions, if we talk about nature-based solutions, or you say nature-based options, I don't care, form follows function. But restoration is very, very important, I think, and not just afforestation, right? That will be my point to you in that context, and I think that had not been explored. The second thing is, in the context of forestry, the duration of forest harvesting cycles is very, very important. We know from science that if you harvest, what we do in Europe and in North America, I don't know about Brazil, but might be similar. If you harvest forests, managed forests after 80 years, 90 years already, you deprive the potential forest carbon sequestration significant. If you prolong the forest cycle, the forest harvesting cycle to 100 years and longer, then you can harvest much more carbon and you will store also much more carbon. So I think there are issues in there which are not just addressed with the simple scheme of afforestation, but need to look into the sustainable management of ecosystems in case they are managed. And we need to look into leaving certain ecosystems alone, protected and alone. Is that possible? I do not know, but I think that's very, very important. Thank you.
Okay. Bill, unless you're, just a second, Bill, if this, is your question related to this or is something else? Okay. Your mic, please. Keep your mic on.
It's not exactly what it is.
Okay, then Thelma, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I'm going to try to be very concise. So, Stephan, thank you for the two issues. So on the first one, on the restoration, I think that the IPCC does include that it depends where you read. When I am reading the AR5, I do see a broader range in the chapter that addresses agriculture, forestry, and other land uses, where you see the restoration as included, not necessarily as ACDR, but I would say that all the options that you have that remove CO2 from the atmosphere would be an option that would be viable. The next issue is a little bit more complex for me. And I agree with you that duration of the harvesting cycle is an important, but you mentioned that to the removal of CO2. And I would say that that removal, it will work if you have not reached the saturation level, right? So the saturation level that would then be very little removal of CO2 from the plantation. So this would be my my comment on this. But to be short. But I agree with you that restoration. We talk also about sequestration of by the soils. We do a lot for that. That potentially is one of the options that would be ready to be implemented. But it is hard because soils are a little bit slow to react, you know, to the changes in practices. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Thelma. Bill, over to you.
Yeah, we've been discussing quite a lot about general principles and issues. And as a scientist, I always like to find examples to talk about and ask questions about. So here's one. A few days ago, the French company Total shipped a shipment of LNG from Northern Australia to China and put out a big press release saying it was carbon neutral. And the carbon neutrality came in part through forest protection in Zimbabwe. Now, when you looked into that example a bit, you found that immediately all these questions that I've just been raising, we've been talking about, exploded into reality, right? Because there's no verifiable system except one run by the private sector to guarantee that these emission neutrality is based on real and additional, for example, sequestration or negative emissions, if you like. There's no ultimate test of this that is multilaterally assessed and organized. And prima facie, I would say that this does not look like at all it is carbon neutral, but it is one of a new set of claims that we are beginning to see emerge from industry, that they are becoming carbon neutral by offsetting their industrial emissions, their CO2 emissions, without actually reducing emissions through carbon sequestration measures. So this is it's an old issue, but it's coming up again now. And it does relate very fundamentally to the kind of governance issues that we're talking about. And it adds a sense of kind of urgency to get on and look at these. And I'm wondering what other colleagues here really think about this, whether this is a viable way forward for companies to launch into the carbon neutral space themselves and thereby set rules de facto, or whether there is a role for governments and the multilateral process to do that first.
It's a very interesting question, Bill, and I think you yourself and many of the other colleagues around the Campfire raised the issue of how do you measure, how do you report, how do you verify, how do you compare. So these issues are clearly there. So, and any quick reactions from colleagues, and then I would like to go to the floor because we have some questions coming in. So, any quick reactions to Bill? Although, or we all agree that this is an issue and we need to yeah, Paul, why don't you have a first go at that?
I won't comment on the specific example because I don't know the details of it, but I think Bill's raising an interesting point about how the use of some of this discourse is going to be taken up. Some of it is primarily communication. And I think this example that you've just quoted, Bill, sounds very much like it's communication by a company to express itself. I mean, this is obviously something we're going to live with as we move forward. It's not new. We've had companies doing this in the past. How far and how does this go? But I think it's also how far we've really started to develop a common understanding of what these challenges really mean. At a government level, at a wider civil society level. And I think our discussion so far shows that's something we haven't gone far enough with. And to give real expression to that, then we can start to look at how do our specific rules at a national level pick up the use of communication by companies, particularly multinational companies who often fall outside national governance in terms of their communication. If this is used in an internal debate, say it's used in a carbon market where a company has a specific target, then we can impose very clear rules on the credibility of what the offsets are. If it's used purely for communication outside, it's harder. So I think it's taking us into new areas, and we'll have to think through, particularly as we move to this real neutrality and then net negative emissions, how does that fit in? I think it's an interesting contribution.
Okay, thank you, Paul. That's helpful. Unless there are other, yes, Julio, go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you. You know, I think this is very interesting and really touches upon one very central topic, which is the participation of the private sector and how we can make sure that that is in line with what we would expect from something that is real, measurable, and transparent. And for many of us in this panel, we have seen that that there have been proposals in the past in the UNFCCC process to see how we can actually have some coherence and integration between the way countries report, governments report on their targets, at the same time giving clear indications and frameworks for the private sector to say what is a meaningful reduction, what is permanent, and how the private sector can actually contribute from their own operations. And I think we need to be honest to ourselves and say that we haven't been successful in that discussion. And that is a problem because behind the example that has been presented, I think there is also the reality that the private sector is increasingly interested in being part of the solution. And if you're not able to make a distinction between things that are simply for communication purposes instead of real solutions and real contributions that aim at what governments are being committing to, I think we're in a situation that we are not, providing the tools and spaces to channel that interest that is coming from the private sector, that is also transitioning to a low carbon cycle. So I think that's also a missing piece of the puzzle that we also need to think about.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just have a very short intervention on that one, Janos?
Yes, go ahead.
Julio, I think we should not make. I understand where you're coming from, and I'm in line with having the role of the private sector understood and working with them as a fundamental implementation agency or sector to help us to achieve what we want. But the private sector is not monolithic. I mean, I'm in the advisory committee of the Science-Based Target Initiative, which has 1,050 companies now. They're so diverse. It's not monolithic. They're all different interests. And it would be a big mistake to believe that those who are the loudest and who are the biggest polluters would determine what is the corporate sector interest in that one. Mm-hmm. I think those who are the loudest and the biggest are also the biggest polluter. And those are those who are responsible that the other companies feel some responsibility to take action. There's a huge difference between Vestas, a windmill producer, and BP or Shell. There's a big difference between Exxon or Gazprom, who want to go carbon neutral as well, and the major medium-sized company which wants to purchase 100% renewables. We need to acknowledge that one. And I think we need to be very sure that we do not allow, and US governments do not allow, for cheating and for greenwashing. Let's work with those companies which are really and truly wanting to reduce emissions as much as possible, and not those who go for cheating with land use emissions. As important that is to invest into protecting forests and go for restoration. I'm not denying that one. But whether we do that via credits and let them off the hook by emitting more CO2 is a completely different thing. We need to be very honest to ourselves that we do not cheat the atmosphere.
Okay. Thank you, Stephan. And Julio, come back quickly. No, we go ahead, yes. And then I want to go to the questions.
It's just that I think it's an interesting conversation, and I couldn't agree more. I mean, the question that I was trying to set or the issue that I was trying to explain is precisely that we don't have a common understanding of how we as governments can avoid being cheated by these efforts from the private sector. And sometimes the private sector is demanding from guidance to say, what, I'm really committed and I really want to contribute to this. But how can I make sure that the efforts that I'm putting in place are going to be recognized as such? What are the standards that I need to comply with in order to do that? And I fully agree. We need to avoid, ignoring those imbalances within the private sector. But this is precisely something that might need to be discussed with all its complexities. And you know, in the UNFCCC process, there's been a lot of discussion about conflict of interest, and we shouldn't avoid that discussion either. But there is a vacuum there, and I think if we want to take the best of those contributions, we might need to have some governance discussion also in trying to define and sort of separate what is pure communication to what is actually a real and honest contribution.
Thank you. It's very interesting, Bill. The issue you put on the table here is to be about something concrete. In this case, it was about Total suggesting that something was or wasn't climate neutral. One of our participants sent up an anonymous note here saying that this, at the same time, Total wants to build an oil pipeline from Uganda across to Tanzania. How can they even mention the world climate friendly and carbon neutral? I leave it at that, just to not complete that picture, but to make that picture richer. But I want to come back to one question that Doreen Stabinski asked, which I think is quite interesting, and it relates to a number of points that have been raised by you, and I'd like you to address that. So earlier we talked a little bit about the relationship between emission reductions and carbon removal. The more we reduce now, the less carbon we will have to remove. It's not clear how much this is known. And at the same time, I think Doreen is saying that how can we keep focus of governments and corporate actors focused on emission reductions? What governance frameworks do we need, or governance actions do we need to make sure that that happens? Because she's saying that the net zero initiatives enable loss of that focus. And then it obscures the magnitude of CDR that is being assumed in net zero, and eventually, of course, let's not forget about net negative pledges. So we need clarity. And how do we achieve that? And there was also mentioned in your various earlier points about participation of the broader group of stakeholders. And I haven't heard much about how to address the idea of developing societal discussions and societal participation in making choices about these different approaches. And Thelma, I do use approaches also not just for nature-based, but for other quote-unquote solutions as well. So anyway, but I think Doreen's question about the focus on emission reductions, what governance actions, frameworks do we need to keep that going? So please, any reactions from any of you?
Well, I think, isn't that in the short run a lot about how national governments design their instruments to achieve emission reductions? So if national governments have a regulatory framework that allows the kind of offsetting that I just mentioned, then the net zero issue becomes exactly as Doreen has described, that it becomes a system for licensing ongoing emissions of greenhouse gases. But if the frameworks are designed that don't allow for that, then you create the incentives not to do it. I mean, the EU trading system, for all its complexities, in general doesn't allow this kind of offsetting to occur within that system. Other governments have approaches that are much more laissez-faire, if I may put it that way, and certainly Australia is one of those. So I think it really comes down to governments getting clear what the purpose of climate policy and climate action is. If it's to really reduce emissions, then they need to construct the instruments to do that. And on the other side of it, to deal with the other side of the equation, need to look at how to introduce policies and incentives for industry to begin investing in the CDR approaches, and to de-risk some of those, and to look at and explore the sustainability trade-offs involved. There is a growing bit of research programs in the European Union, for example, through the Horizon 2020, or German Research Ministry, for example, now, and other places, which is is significant, but not enough. And I think that other countries need to look at that as well, because a lot of these issues are very country specific, as I think Thelma alluded to in a different way. Where is the CO2 going to be stored? What are the options? Well, they're different in each country, and there are going to be different sustainability trade-offs. And if you go back to those general governance points I was talking about, I talked to 5 of 9, then you can locate these issues within that framework for governments to look at. And I think that's just something to really reflect on. As for the public awareness and acceptance, I think that is also a good question. And somehow there hasn't been enough debate about this, or if there is a debate, it's very polarized. So I think one also needs to reflect on ways to have public discussions about these issues that aren't as polarized as they've been in some contexts.
Thank you, Bill. I think, Paul, you would like to also respond to this?
Yeah, quite quickly. I think there is another framework we need to bring into here, which is the work that governments are doing in developing long-term strategies to get to sort of decarbonize totally our economies and think through the way forward, at least to the middle of the century, is the main time frame most of us have been working on. As I said at the start, I'm not speaking on behalf of the French government here, but there is in France, a national low carbon strategy taking us to net zero by 2050. That does include some use of sequestration, of course, strengthening that in the land and forestry sector, but not in a broader sort of logic of trading. It's not that sense, it's on our national territory. But I mean, these are tools which can also be used to have part of this conversation. As we think through what is that transition we're taking forward, it becomes explicit what we are thinking about driving down emissions totally in the energy production or electricity production and wider energy sector. It becomes explicit what we're thinking about emissions in industry. It becomes explicit about what we're thinking in building and other service areas of our economy. So these choices become much clearer when we put it in that framework. It's not a choice between a generic debate on carbon dioxide reduction or not. It is, what are the specific policy frameworks we are putting in place as governments? And I think this is where some of that debate must take place. And I think that is also an area we must probably go further in involving the public. I mean, in France, again, we have just had the fascinating experience of having a citizens convention looking at our climate policies and making recommendations. There's now a slightly awkward debate about how far the government and then our parliament will take that up. And I don't want to comment in detail, that's ongoing. But these are places that we can find new methods, new approaches, so that people are engaged in exactly these sort of choices. And I think things like citizens' conventions can be a way to bring that choice into our national policy making processes, although it is not easy to link that back in to the more traditional legislative processes, and we're trying to find a way forward on that in France at the moment, respecting what we got from our citizens, debating with at a government level and with our parliamentarians.
Thank you. Okay, can I just continue on the same line and maybe ask Thelma to say a few words here? We've heard a lot, but for one thing, what both Bill and Paul are saying is the need for an overarching climate response strategy and show the connections between these, and then have that go through whatever public consultation interaction process you have in your respective countries or regions. Now, within that, we've heard a couple of times connections to incentivizing research, particularly in developing countries. Thelma, you had that. We also have some question here about how can African governments be convinced about some of these issues. So I just want to focus a little bit on part of this picture, on what you think would be usefully done in whatever overall governance frameworks in order to incentivize research. in developing countries, and in order to engage developing countries, at least in consideration of these issues. It's not about pushing them to use this technology or not, or that approach or that, but it's the consideration thereof. And then I would welcome other colleagues also to address that.
Yes, thanks, Janos. You know, what we know is that most countries do have their own research groups that are most of the time strong as well. But the issue is how these things are scattered. And sometimes, you know, a focus on a specific aspect or technology, or as I said, some focus on something specific of interest to the country, but not an overall idea of the research and implications. As I said, you know, I very much appreciate public awareness, as I already mentioned. I think there is a need for people to understand why some things, you know, are being discussed. So I would say that there are several ways we can stimulate a broader discussion on research and bringing more research communities together. And I think that this has to be outside the realm of the, for instance, of UN bodies, which might take a long time to do this, or focus on a specific aspects. But you know, to have institutions that would stimulate the discussions, which could start to be developed at a regional level, where I think you know, countries share common problems and issues, and then broaden up to a more global level of research. But I also would like Janos to say, you know, especially, you know, in developing countries, and now I'm going to use only one thing that IPCC deems as a very important element for the implementation of mitigation. And I would say that, you know, if we do ambitious mitigation, we would not need necessarily to make use of, you know, other options, including CDR, despite, although for the 1.5, some level of CDR will be necessary. But so when we are talking about ambitious mitigation and looking at it as how IPCC sees international cooperation as one of the means by which, you know, this could be stimulated, in particular for developing countries. This could basically help a lot this transition, especially because the developing countries have potentially more room or flexibility, and I'm talking as myself here, for changing or doing the transition to a carbon neutrality, maybe, or decarbonization, you name it, because they are still in the process of development. But what I see is an impediment. First of all, every time we see some financial incentive on the table for this, personal, again, very personal, we see that first of what comes on the table is risk assessment. And this might, you know, avoid the implementation that could be rapid, because you have so many constrained conditions for the implementation of some of these transitions because of the risk, in particular for some areas or some continents in the developing world, in the South, global South, as we say. So you see, even if you think about the Green Climate Fund or other means of stimulating financially, it is not easy. The money is not there. It is promised it's not there. So basically there is a mistrust of the developing world, I would say. Please understand it is absolutely personal. A mistrust of the developing world, which thinks that we were not the ones that brought the situation as it stands. We want to help a lot, but also we don't see the promises. We don't see a fair, we want to use the equity, fair transition. And this is an issue that I think should also be discussed. You know, when we think about bringing these issues of governance, and I think at some level it needs to be to the Climate Change Convention or to UN bodies, especially because you are thinking about broader things like, for instance, the impacts of these options in sustainable development. These need so safeguards. We need to have something in place. And I think it's helpful. But when you bring this at a UN level, these discussions take so long and we don't have the time. So we don't have the time. We need to be quick. So maybe we need to find a way to stimulate action, you know, at least because we cannot think that we cannot do actions that do not need to be brought to a UN level or but we can initiate like research. I think is something that we can do without too much constraint. Just some ideas popping up here.
Can I just follow up on one thing you said very briefly, because we're getting to the end of this session, but you said that developing countries may be more flexible and more capacity, but that maybe to do carbon removal because they're still at the early stages of development. At the same time, and as remarked by one of our participants, that many of the developing countries like Global South, their industrialization policies are very, very much focused on carbon, on fossil fuels. So does that work? How do you see that? Briefly, if you may, if you can.
I see this as a transition because they might not know other means quickly to change. Mm-hmm. So they need to have the opportunity to have options mm-hmm. for the development. Mm-hmm. And I think this is missing. You know, we talk about technology transfer, we talk about financial, which is not everything. I mean, you know, we are being simplistic in this discussion. We have several other issues at domestic level, like the level of the institutions, the strengthening the institutions, having policies in place, a good governance. So there is a lot there. But these, you know, if we are waiting for the ideal world, this might, you know, how actions that could start. We look at the NDCs. You know, developing countries have put forward NDCs that are not constrained and others are. You know, so why not to explore those things?
Well, we're coming to the end. What I'd like to do now is, if we have 2 minutes in total, so I'd like to ask each of you for 20, 30 seconds, just a quick thought on what do you expect, on the one hand, in COP26 about these issues and beyond in the UNFCCC. So one is the UNFCCC process, UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the other is, what do you expect in some of the other key intergovernmental processes that are going forward, such as the Biodiversity Convention, such as the IUCN's Congress next year. So there's big things happening. Anybody would like to start? 20, 30 seconds each. Thelma, very short.
COP26, very short.
Yeah.
One of them, Article 6.
Okay.
Article 6, I think, needs to, you know, come to an end, and I hope it comes to an end in a way that doesn't compromise the integrity of the whole process. Mm-hmm. So that is one. And then the next one, I know that the focus is going to be on nature-based solutions, and I hope that we have an honest discussion on the potential for those solutions or options, as I like to say, considering the limitations and potential of those options.
Fantastic. Thank you.
30 seconds.
Yeah, perfect. Any other reactions? Yes, Julio. Thank you.
Quick comment. I think most of this discussion will be determined by how much ambition is communicated in new NDCs and long-term strategies, as Paul was saying. If we don't see the needle moving in that regard, I think the urgency of a discussion about removals and you know, planning for long-term mitigation will be shaking up a little bit, and that will be seen in COP26. As you know, the Secretariat will prepare a synthesis report of all the NDCs presented this coming year, and that would be a very important topic to cover. Just a very short reference also. In COP26, we need to also discuss the Coronivia joint work. Some of the aspects related to agriculture will look also into carbon in soils, and that might also spark an interesting conversation about nature-based options or solutions, as you want to say, to call it.
Thank you. Paul, very quickly, and then Bill.
Okay, I can only echo Thelma in wanting to see Article 6 finished. That's in the capable hands now of my successor, Tosi, and I'm sure between the Chilean presidency and the UK presidency, I'm sure they will deliver. But I do think it's important to see how that works, although I don't think it solves the specific interactions with the areas we're talking about here today. So making sure the rules are in place for the Paris Agreement that moves forward. As Julio said, it's very much about the ambition. And I think seeing very clearly what we're doing, just as we were saying a few minutes ago, really bringing the emissions down needs to be very clear. And then finally, it's the interaction with the other processes. We also have the COP15 under biodiversity in China. There's also on the desertification side, there are these other interactions. We need to be working more closely together across conventions and in different areas, and building the capacity to look at those challenges across different lines.
Thank you, Paul. Bill, very briefly, please.
Well, I like everyone, I'm hoping that Article 6 comes to a conclusion, but in an environmentally sound way. But I do worry if it does come to a conclusion, what will happen to the lives of the Article 6 negotiators. I think they won't know what to do with themselves. But standing back a bit, I think that what we're looking at now with so many countries, China, the European Union, Japan, Korea, likely a Biden presidency, to be optimistic, we'd end up with 2/3 of the global economy under a greenhouse gas net zero goal for around 2050 or shortly afterwards for the COP, and a whole lot more, I would imagine. So that means ambition will be back on the agenda big time. So I'm going to be optimistic about that and say that this could be a COP of you know, which establishes the momentum we really need. But one of the big issues that does worry me is where the nature-based solutions options, as Thelma puts it, is going. Because what I see from the industry side is a very big emphasis on using nature-based offsets to continue to emit at scale. And I don't think we've thought our way around the implications of that properly for actually achieving real emission reductions. That would be a very serious hole below the waterline in the whole system if that became the case. So I think that I agree with Thelma, that needs to be a big issue at the COP.
Thank you, Bill. And Stephan, 10 seconds, last words.
Yeah, thank you for 10 seconds.
Okay, 15.
Speaking for CAN, or speaking as CAN, we're a little bit more skeptical. We believe that the UNFCCC negotiations are basically doing at best damage limitations. They haven't delivered on many issues. They haven't delivered on loss and damage. They haven't delivered on ambition. They haven't delivered on Article 6. And even if they agree on Article 6, agreeing on Article 6 is not a goal, because we prefer no agreement on Article 6 rather than a kind of loophole which allows offsets, double counting, and other bad solutions. So gonna be honest with you guys here. What we believe is the real options happen somewhere else. We see national implementation. We believe that renewable energy implementation, energy efficiency, investments, technology innovation is very important. And that doesn't happen on the level of the UNFCCC, unfortunately. That happens nationally or regionally, if you want, in terms of legislation and implementation by governments and by countries. And that's where the focus is. We're going to be there, of course, because we need to be there. But we do not believe that COP, 26 in Glasgow will be the breakthrough. It's damage limitation. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephan. And with that, thank you very much. This was a very interesting discussion. And thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Colleagues, good night, good morning, whatever. Bye.